in our industry, there's a huge focus on clients that are older, right? Because there's a lot of money when you've saved a lot of money, you've retired. But one of the cool things that we get to work on is the 401k space with a lot of younger participants. And when we're in that space and we're talking through the different components with them, we often hear a lot of jokes about it, saying, why am I trying to save now? I don't even know if I'm going to make it to retirement. And while it's said in jest, there is a small component of that is true. A lot of times what we do see with younger participants is they're trying to navigate the current environment, which can be incredibly difficult. A lot of people are paycheck to paycheck. Statistically, it's growing in the United States. And what we're seeing in that is people are trying to balance all the different things that they have, the long-term goals, the vision with that, but also trying to understand, hey, do I have enough for an emergency savings? Can I buy groceries this week? Rent? Is buying a house even in the cards for me? And so what we try to do is we start where the participants are at. We try to ask their goals. What is important to you? First off, do you have that discretionary income? But also, do you maybe want to have a wedding one day? Do you have goals for owning a home, and what does that look like? Then we can work backwards to see what kind of funds do you have currently. And that's where a spending plan may come into play to say, hey, let's look at your expenses, and is there anything discretionary that we can build off of? If there is, great. That's where we look into emergency savings. So we'll start there. We'll talk through all those components. And then we try to look longer term and see what we can build out saving into retirement. What we really try to emphasize is at least that employer match. That's a real key piece there that we essentially call free money, where the employer is incentivizing you to save. And when we look at it from a long-term view and show compounding interest, it's a really key part of trying to save long-term. And when we show that to younger participants, then it makes it real. Then it makes it something that they can tangibly see, and it allows them to save a little bit more in the long term. One thing that's also super key for younger participants is they've grown up in a technology-driven world. So how can older advisors blend that and show information in ways that is receptive to them? Well, the first thing is working with record keepers that utilize very good interfaces. So is the software interactive? Is it something that maybe they can run projections themselves, build their own expenses in, and show the different pieces of that so that they can see, hey, if my expenses go down this way, if I want to build this in, what is the success probability of my plan being successful? So that's one key piece. The other thing that we're trying to integrate is AI. AI is something that's here to stay and it's continuing to build. Is there different ways that AI can be utilized with participants, maybe to answer basic plan questions in the documents, maybe understanding how to log in certain ways and help the advisors scale with younger participants so that they can get to where they want to go. I've had a lot of participants sometimes ask, well, if it's only 1, 2, maybe 3% I can contribute, is it even worth it? And the answer is yes, it is, because again, most of the employer matches are a formula. So even if you're only doing 2, 3%, you're getting that additional match, even if it's a small amount. And when you're talking about a long time, when you invest in markets and you put money in, then you're able to have growth on top of it. And as it continues to go in, we call it dollar cost averaging. So every time that you contribute monthly, it's consistently going in to the different price points of the market. And when we look through that over a long period of time, even 2 to 3% makes a substantial difference. You layer on potentially Social Security, if you have any pension income, it does lead to a factor. And the other thing that we talk about too is a lot of times people ask about pre-tax versus Roth and the different components of that. Well, if you're contributing pre-tax, then you may not even feel it as much in your paycheck because there's not even taxes taken out. So there's a portion, possibly 20% if that's withheld, that you would see coming out in your paycheck that's not like that. So it's actually more like an 80% hit than 100% when the money's coming out like that. Student loan debt is another question I get a lot, and that goes back into the discretionary expenses. So as we look at it, that's something you got to prioritize, especially if you're looking at a 9, 10, 11% interest rate. It can be incredibly high. And so, when we look at that we can help participants strategize around that and say, okay, let's maybe do the avalanche method and work on the higher interest rate first. But what other income do you have beyond that? And even if it's just a little bit in the 401k and the priority is working down those student loans, then that's a big factor as well, because you need to be able to do that. If you're looking at interest rate arbitrage, that higher rate on the loan is not something you're necessarily going to get in the market. So it makes sense to prioritize that loans, but at least saving a little bit for retirement allows you to build a full picture long term. And so we get questions sometimes about participants that are leaving different different jobs, and depending on what their salary is or income, does it affect that, and does it affect the investments? And so what we say is, first off, 401ks are portable, so you can take them anywhere. There's no tax implications for that. So if you leave to another employer that is a 401k, you might have to wait out. They have a period of time where you can't transfer. Sometimes it's 6 months or a year, but once you do that, there's no tax consequences. Now, each 401k is going to have a different advisor, so there might be different funds in that, but you can basically create the same allocation. So if you say, hey, I want 40% in large cap growth, and in other pieces around that, you want maybe 15-20% in bonds if you're younger, that's a piece where you can use their funds but create the same allocation. Now, the salary is an impact, and so obviously if it's a percentage basis and your salary goes down, it's going to be less coming out of your paycheck each month, and so that does affect the long-term vision in a sense. So that's where the planning component's important to work with an advisor, or if you have one of those softwares that can show the projection, seeing how that impact is on the lower amount can allow you to figure out if your goals are attainable. Habits are super key when it comes to investing in retirement, all aspects of life. But when you're able to create something subconsciously and you're consistently doing it, it's something that becomes part of your daily life, and you don't even have to consistently worry about what that looks like. So the cool thing about, I mentioned dollar cost averaging. Dollar cost averaging is extremely important, not just because fundamentally it makes sense in market statistically. If you consistently contribute in markets, it typically, the price goes lower, and so you're actually buying at a larger gain. So that's one piece that's important. But psychologically, if it's not even on your mind and you're able to make it work, that's where we say put your savings first and then have your expenses afterwards. Because if you just take expenses and then you say whatever's left over I'll save, then if it's not a priority, it's not going to be a habit that you build consistently. So make that the priority first and use what you have left over to be able to spend. Sometimes we'll get participants who are maybe in their mid-30s and they've recently paid off their debt. Their priority was paying down. And then they ask, is it even worth saving at that time? And I think that brings an interesting question, because psychologically, I would say yes, right? They've built the habit to consistently save, in this case, saving to pay down the debt. Now you're just switching gears towards investing in your future. And mid-30s can be an interesting time too, because maybe you've paid off the debt, but maybe now you're having children, and maybe there's additional expenses built onto that, or there's a job shift and income is changing. It's typically a time where maybe you could start to hit the peak of your career earnings. And this is where we talk about that compounding again. So yes, the time frame is important. If you start saving in your 20s, you don't have to save as much statistically as somebody who starts in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. But it's still good to start. And that's the key part of this, is you don't want to wait until you're 40, 50, and 60. Sometimes we do run into people who are in their late 50s and they haven't saved very much. And they come back and say, what do we do? And we look at the projection, and unfortunately, they have to work a while. So depending on your expenses and your income, that's where the projection comes in. If you're in your mid-30s, look at it. See what you have discretionary, and you may have to save a larger amount, but not substantially, and you can still get to your goals. So a lot of times when we speak to younger participants, one of the roadblocks to saving is they're not sure how long they'll even live. They don't think they're going to have longevity. But statistically, 60% of retirees underestimate how long they will live by at least 5 years. And that brings a larger point to the table, which is a lot of people focus on investment risk, but they don't think about longevity risk. What is the risk that you retire and 20 years in retirement, you run out of money? You're no longer employable. You're in a tough spot, and you might have to focus on government assistance. So focusing on longevity is extremely important, especially with longevity now comes potential long-term care needs. Would you ever have to go into a facility? Would you ever have special needs that have to be taken care of towards the end of your life? And that can be incredibly expensive, up to $120,000 a year at some facilities. And so when we look at these key pieces, starting now and saving for those, that's the risk that you're taking by not starting. And so we want to make sure that that's not something that you ever have to worry about. One thing I'd add as well is a lot of times people think about compounding interest. What they don't factor in is that the earlier you start, the less over your life that you have to contribute, because the money is working for you. And And so what we say there is you start now and you contribute more earlier on in your life. You may be at a point in your late 30s, early 40s where you've built up a good base, you feel comfortable there, and you can stay at a lower percentage. You don't have to max out your 401k if you don't want to. And that allows you the flexibility to save for other things. Maybe you have home repairs at that time. Maybe you want to take a trip to Europe or someplace you haven't been to before. Maybe you want to buy a second home closer to the beach or a lake. That gives you the flexibility to do the things that you want to do earlier than just retirement goals, because life doesn't just begin at retirement. The ability to do different things that you want to earlier in your life while you're still working is what makes a life sustainable.